The first story. I never got home. This story happened to me in my innocent 13 years. It is real, with no fiction or plagiarism. We lived in a secluded summer cottage village. It was busy mostly in the summer and spring, while for the rest of the year, only the locals stayed for the winter. Not the point. My friend and I loved to climb around unfinished cottages, often unguarded, wandering through the floors and finding animal corpses in the basements that had accidentally fallen in and couldn't get out. Every day we explored new places, rode our bikes, stole fruit from the cottages, and generally enjoyed our summer and youth. One day, after another ride around the new sites, I stayed over at my friend's place in the evening. Due to poor asphalt, my bike tire went flat at the most inconvenient time. We spent almost until 8 p.m. fixing it. Finally, I got on my bike and headed home. Despite the summer season, it was already dark. I turned onto the path leading to my house. To the right, I noticed a dark silhouette that looked like a man squatting. I thought it was our local watchman, who often walked at night with his dogs. He lived alone and was unsociable. I approached to say hello, and then, you know that feeling like sleep paralysis? When you're conscious, you want to scream, but you can't control yourself. Something dark slowly rose to its full height, which turned out to be much taller than a human. It slowly approached me. I sat on my bike as if rooted to the spot. My legs wouldn't move. I couldn't even cry. It sat on the luggage rack, and under its weight the wheel bent, and the rear part sagged heavily. I felt heavy hands drop onto my shoulders, and something fiery was burning my back. Finally, mastering myself, I began to pedal, but they were turning in vain, as if the chain had slipped. It squeezed my shoulders tighter. If it had lasted longer, I would have had a fracture. Somehow, it disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. I flew back to my friend's place like a bullet. It was closer than my own home. Reaching his house, I started knocking on the iron gates. Breaking the lump in my throat, tears streamed down my face. I was choking on them, but I had no strength to scream. The yard was dark, the lights were off. At my noise, my friend's father ran out, and opening the door, he froze in horror. "Where have you been?" "Your parents are looking for you." I couldn't utter a word. It felt like my tongue was stuck to my throat. My face stung from the tears, my eyes hurt, and there was a burning pain between my shoulder blades. I collapsed to the ground. They took me inside, gave me something to drink, calmed me down, and called my parents. When they arrived, I was still in shock. My hair was half gray, my mother was panicking, and my father was worried. Seeing them, I rushed to them, and only then did I feel unbearable pain in my back. It turned out there was a deep cut, blood oozing, and my shirt was torn on the back. I was urgently taken to the clinic. The duty doctor examined the wound, cleaned it, bandaged it, and began to fill out the documents. So, the time is 5:13. The date is 27.08.200. "What do you mean? The time is 5:13. I left my friend's place around 8 p.m. The road home takes at most 5 minutes, plus 10 minutes with this creature. All of this took no more than 30 to 35 minutes. I arrived at my friend's place immediately. My parents came quickly too, and we got to the clinic in no more than 40 minutes. As I was later told, I left my friend's place and disappeared for the whole night. My parents were worried. They contacted my friend's parents, and they said I had left around 9 p.m. A search began. Panic ensued. My mother said they drove by that place multiple times with lights, but they didn't find me there. It turns out I was gone the whole night, although for me, only an hour had passed. A reasonable explanation for what happened was never found, and it still isn't. As a reminder of that night, a long burgundy scar still adorns my back. I'm now a young father, and we live in a similar cottage village. My son is growing up, and he's a copy of me. He loves wandering around abandoned places. On a bicycle. After 8 p.m., neither I nor my child go outside. I wouldn't want anyone to encounter this again. The second story. Shadows of the dead. For as long as I can remember, I have always seen what others cannot. In my childhood, everyone attributed it to a rich imagination and high sensitivity, and even now I like to comfort myself with that explanation. In my teenage years, people blamed hormonal changes, an immature nervous system, anything but the most obvious reason. And the most obvious reason is that I simply see what others cannot. There were a few people in my life who understood and accepted me with my secret. The first person was my mother, who also felt everything differently than others. Many said our family was abnormal, yet they would come to us with all their problems, cry on our shoulders, and ask for help. And my mother helped as much as she could. She never held crystals in her hands and rarely read tarot cards. Usually she just said what she felt, and it turned out to be true. Maybe that's why it was easier for my mother to live with such a secret than it is for me. She managed to filter the incredible amount of information that came to her, but I cannot. I remember the first time I saw what my mother later called the shadow. We were walking back from the lake after swimming. I was about 7 or 8 years old. It was a fun day, so I couldn't have been thinking about anything like that. I saw a man standing at the edge of the shore, slightly hidden by a bush. At first he looked at all of us, sad and detached, and then he looked at me with surprise. He seemed surprised that someone noticed him. My mother then whispered in my ear that she saw him too and asked me to describe him. My description matched hers completely. We saw the same thing, and so my mother and I had a shared secret. And so my life went on. I saw them everywhere in the street, on public transport, even at school. Then, through questioning, I would find out who that person was, and people would look at me like I was crazy. How could I know what a person who died decades ago looked like? When I was 15, my mother died. Suddenly, without any illness or pathology. But as I later understood, we both felt something, although of course we couldn't have imagined death. Life had just finally settled after a series of problems, and everything was generally good. Our lives changed drastically. It was very hard, painful, and unfair. We moved far away from our hometown friends. I left behind everything I liked, everyone I loved and cherished. And from that moment, my life turned into a real nightmare. Now I encountered shadows not once a month or less, as before, but every day. They could just pass by me, look out from a mirror, or even from a box from which I was unpacking my things after we moved. And the most frightening, of course, was seeing my mother. That encounter was not joyful, although I dreamed of seeing her. It happened a couple of days before the funeral. I woke up at around 2 a.m., tormented by terrible thirst and freezing cold. I quickly got a drink and ran back to bed. And then it began the thing that still horrifies me. My own mother, not looking at all like her living self, crawled toward me along the wall. She looked like a horrifying version of herself, a broken doll, and did not resemble the happy, beautiful woman she was. Even after death, in her coffin, she didn't look that frightening. She crawled toward me simultaneously, fast and very slowly, and I couldn't move or scream. My mother sat on my bed, at my feet, and stared at me with huge eyes. When she started speaking, chills ran down my spine from head to toe. She said she was very cold and thirsty. She sat like that for a few more minutes and then just disappeared the moment I blinked. The next day, I somehow wasn't as scared, although I was still worried about my mother. Now, I can't even understand how I didn't go insane from the terror. The next time, my mother appeared in a dream, completely different. This happened after the funeral. I cried a lot and then went to sleep. And that dream was the best in my life. In it, my mother was as I remembered her, even better. We talked. She gave me advice and warned me about what was to come. We said goodbye, and I never had a similar dream with her again. Then, a loved one came into my life, who for the past 5 years has been experiencing for himself that I see a bit more than other people. I've seen so many frightening, horrifying things that brought me to tears. For example, at our mutual friend's funeral, I clearly saw him standing near his crying parents, trying in vain to comfort them. He didn't immediately realize that I could see him. And so it happens every time, as if for the first time. You can't get used to it. These shadows are always nearby. Know this when goosebumps run down your spine for no reason and your neck feels cold, as if touched by a cold breeze that's a shadow trying to get your attention.